Good afternoon. Welcome to the Government Operational Committee August 21st meeting. Welcome everybody in the room today. Happy Monday. Hopefully everybody have a blessed week. Can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes from our last meeting? We did not have a meeting in July because we took some time off, but our last meeting minutes was June 12th. Can I get a motion for approval?
So move.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Right. Moving on to Mr. Josh, Parker Program.
Yes, so as y'all know, the parklet moratorium runs out on September 19th, which is why we put a title only on the agenda for this current cycle in case y'all do decide to recommend a solution at this meeting related to parklets. If we don't reach a conclusion, we're going to have to extend the parklet moratorium, and we'll work with the attorney's office to do that. But that is one reason why we've tried to keep this front and center. But if not, we'll work with the attorney's office to extend it. So first we come back with follow-ups from our last meeting. And so in advance, we emailed y'all Friday a couple of those documents, and Andrew, our Central Services Director, is here to go through them, as well as Angel. And Stephen as well from the TPW perspective in case y'all have any questions. But we're going to talk about some of those potential edits and look at the draft. Y'all also requested a map of downtown showing where parklets are potentially viable. And there was questions about pricing, so we've included a document related to pricing options as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Andrew, and we'll begin working through your file.
Do you have this map for online by any chance? Should be a PDF.
So first I'll ask Angel, she's worked with folks in our office to give you an assessment of parklet accessibility and availability as it's written in the ordinance.
So the downtown boundary is the red boundary line, and then we went through and we marked the streets. Like the ordinance says, if a street is over the speed limit of 25 miles per hour, you can't have a parklet. If it's a state highway, we can't put parklets. So all of those are marked here in color. The blue is where the parklets are possible, just based on whether there's buffered bike lanes, because that's shown on here. The speed limit over 25 is the green. State highway is the orange. And those are all places that we don't have parklets. The next page is, we also did a breakdown of the downtown area where parklets can be. The first page shows you the potential as it is now. This includes, like, we took out where there's like government facilities or churches or banks. We took all those out on this first page. So this shows you the potential for parklets in downtown, the number of potential. The next page takes out government facilities. This just assumes that any building anywhere can be a parklet. And so then the next page gives you a breakdown of what numbers of parklets would be in place, could be in place then.
And those would be total spaces allocated to parklets, not unique parklets. So where there's a 7, for example, the ordinance says no less than 2 spaces and no more than 4. So that could be anywhere between 3 or 2 parklets within a 7 space allocation. So really it's that second map that is most relevant to density, because that speaks to the likelihood of a parklet being in those areas. Certainly, while you could see redevelopment of, let's say, the Athens First UMC property that would generate some restaurants, you're not likely to see that, and therefore, at least as we're considering ordinance changes today, you're not likely to see parklets in those areas. So the main takeaway is on any given block, you'd be looking at a maximum number of permits between 1 and 3. Are there any questions about that before we?
I'll try to look. I apologize. I know I read up on stuff. Had to take my computer and do some upgrades. What for the parking goes, anything will be affected with the parking
Well, yes, so this second map shows you if every restaurant or specialty shop or cafe, kind of like, Starbucks.
Right.
Pulled a permit for a parklet everywhere that there's physically one of those spaces. This is the absolute maximum amount of parking that you would be impacting as a total number of spaces.
Okay.
We certainly have not seen that density downtown even when they were free. And then once we rolled out a program with fees, we saw some initial interest of 4.5. One later pulled out. They decided it was not feasible for them personally, and then another was caught in the moratorium.
So currently, I think I counted 7 parklets now. 3. Okay.
It's South Kitchen and Bar, Trapeze, and Five Spoon on, Pumpkin.
Okay. So out of the 3, so we, since a year and a half of implementation, 2 years, I believe, right? Only 3 have applied other than the national, correct?
Well, the national applied and later withdrew, and then we were aware of some interest from Paloma.
Okay.
But that was after the moratorium went into place. Have you had anybody else approach?
No.
Okay. All right. So moving on to the language.
Well, not quite.
Okay.
So y'all had asked about pricing. You'll take one of them. So we dusted off some analysis we did the last time this was in committee. This is different ways that you might value space downtown. In the second column, parklet program column, you'll see what the current annual fees would be if you were to permit a parklet in 2, 3, or 4 spaces. So it's somewhere between $2,000 and $6,000. The first 2 spaces are cheaper than the next 2. If we look at just downtown parking revenues, which we did modify what ADDA had previously told us to reflect a 25-cent per hour increase. In general, you're generating now around $3,300 per space per year. I apologize for the confusion last time when we were talking about spaces that are equal to $20,000 or $25,000. Those are the primary, like the primo spaces. So some of those that might be on Broad, former College Square, places like that. Certainly a space on Doherty generates far less. So we just have given you an average. The ADDA also allows for construction parking where you would have a permit if you needed to put a dumpster or a work truck. That's valued at $10 per space per day. And then just, even though it's not apples to apples, we've given you some reflection of what it would cost to permit the same amount of space as a sidewalk cafe, which would not be in the parking area, but rather on your streetscape. So the takeaway here is parklets are valued at 4 to 6 times what we value sidewalk cafes, but really just a fraction of what that real estate is valued at as it relates to some form of parking.
This is helpful.
So, and this was the question I had over the weekend, and I wanted to thank you, Happy, for, so like, what are we losing, even though there's only 3 parklet, what are we losing in revenue from the parking?
Well,
10 spaces.
yeah.
10 spaces?
It's about $40,000 on parking revenue. There is probably some alcohol and retail sales that comes up on the backside of that, but I would be surprised if it was $40,000 to the government.
So if a parklet is adding revenue to a business, if they get that additional capacity, additional space, so they're generating more revenue, but we as a government are losing that revenue in those parking. And if you look at the equivalencies of construction parking and downtown parking revenue, I mean, it is like,
Gotta be higher.
yeah, but
Well, the other thing to take into account, and I'm parklets, which we would, I think we're going to probably discuss how they look, but the other businesses, as a totality of downtown and have a.
Um, if we make any additions to the parklet fees, would the existing business be grandfathered in?
Yeah, so what we talked about is that these are all annual licenses.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, I think those that have licenses now are set for that, whatever that period is. Afterwards, the changes would go into effect.
So they would be good through December 31st, but any change of fees would go into effect in January, should you choose to recommend a change.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I see that it would be fair to set fees at a rate that was close to equivalent to the money that the government would be generating, from those spaces where they'd be used as parking spaces. And I do feel like, there certainly is some money coming into the government through increased sales. I mean, I'm someone who specifically seeks out, a place to eat based on whether or not they have outdoor seating. So there are certainly places that I'm patronizing more because they have parklets. And I know a lot of other people like that, especially anybody that has hearing issues. Indoor restaurant environments can be pretty uncomfortable. So, I could see us reevaluating the fees. And I know we want to talk about the height of the parklets. I also think we should talk about, limiting availability to when restaurants have pre-existing outdoor spaces. I feel like this parklet program is intended to kind of give an extra boost to our smaller local businesses. And when you have larger establishments that already have huge outdoor, patios or whatever, and maybe we can, say if you have a patio that has the capability of seating more than, 10 or 12 people, you don't qualify for a frontal park. You already have street cafe allowance there.
So like the last resort.
Yeah, last resort. I'm thinking Paloma Park, even Clocked and Ted's. These are places that have really nice pre-existing outdoor patios. And if we feel like the streets are getting cluttered with parklets, or the parklets are infringing on other businesses' abilities to have larger parklets, maybe that's something we can do. I just would hate to see some of these places be like the business that ate an entire block. I want some variety and diversity downtown, and I feel like, allowing, expanded opportunities for smaller businesses, and, allowing places that already have, really nice resources on their own property, that enables the smaller businesses to kind of take this opportunity.
Well, maybe we can see if the increment, I'm hoping you have some recommendations for us.
Well, we definitely have recommendations in the text edit that are forthcoming, but they don't speak to pricing or further limiting parklet availability based off of the availability of privately provided space. And there's a couple of reasons why I would encourage some caution on that. First, it would be difficult to be able for us to understand how many people are permitted in a space. So for example, Starland Pizza, they have a sidewalk cafe that encroaches beyond the front of their building a bit, but they also have an alcove that goes back, and that alcove has some seating. But are we generating this threshold based on number of people that can be set, or is it based on standing room, which is more likely how that's used later in the evening as it transitions maybe to more of a bar format? Also, outside of historic districts, our development code would require you to build to the lot line when you are redeveloping a site downtown. And so think the places you've named would predominantly be captured within historic districts, so maybe there's a, clear divergence there, but, it's just weird to me that somebody could have one now and they could be choosing to redevelop their site. Let's go with, let's say that Last Resort is not in a historic district. I don't know if it is or isn't. They can have one now, and then we could say, no, you can't have that without a variance or even a different zoning class. Therefore, we're taking away that right, but now you are eligible for a parklet. I just don't get a sense that it's going to be a huge issue. If I was worried about this, I might speak to demand. So these numbers that I've given you are actually anything with a fraction is rounded up on 30%. So one easy way to protect parking is to say, no more than 30% of parking in a block, with no less than 2 spaces. So that would allow any block to have one parklet, similar to like what you see with Thai Spoon.
You got that, your recommendation?
And I do not right now, but we could add that fairly easily.
But we haven't been asked to do that because it hasn't been a problem to date.
Right.
I mean, I'm not opposed to more than one parklet in a block. What I'm concerned about is one business taking up all the parklet opportunities on one block.
If I could share, and I do want to let people know that John Hopkins is joining us remotely, so it's possible he may want to jump in. He will be transitioning to take over the GOC. Austin and I are just here because we've been involved in these topics more. But John and I had a chance to discuss this prior to this, and also we spoke with Judd and Austin previously, and I think our concern is that we recognize that the rational basis test is a relatively low test for, when a government takes an action, but we're struggling with what the governmental interest is for why we should treat a business that maybe has an outside patio differently than a separate business. And I understand what you're explaining about wanting to have diversity, but I'm not sure that there's a way to articulate that avoids legal liability, because there isn't a good justification for why the government, I would argue, should care whether a slightly smaller, slightly larger business has access to the parklet. So I would just encourage you all not to give every business the same opportunity to have a parklet downtown.
Well, let me ask you, so, but what Andrew's saying is if we limit it to 30%, is that a problem?
Well, right now it says 30%. So what I brought you is a worst case scenario, which is if it was 7.1 spaces, I rounded to 8. Because as I look at the way the ordinance is written now, I can take the liberty and say it's 30%-ish, right? But if you all are worried about that, if we say no more than 30% with no less than 2, like 30.0%, that then gives us on the permitting and review side the authority to say, well, yes, there's 22 spaces on this stretch of a block, but unfortunately that does not mean that 8 can be a parklet. That means it's 7. So we're going to round down to that 30 rather than dealing with a fraction. That would reduce these numbers. I could give you the exact count, but it's going to be probably a dozen spaces that would be off the table because there was a lot of rounding up.
Well, and I guess the 30%, I get that part, but what are we talking about, like 30% in one block?
Yes, so the ordinance is 30% by block right now, but it doesn't clarify on how we deal with fractions.
It's on each side of the block.
Just one.
Which is why you see on this different sides of the street, because there's different parking conditions on each one.
And if I could just really very quickly, I realized I kind of misspoke when I said all businesses. What I meant by that was all the restaurants, all of the businesses that are within that category. But I just wanted to make sure we're not getting into really small differences within a class of business, if that makes sense.
All right, so before we get too into this one topic, let's get back to the parklets ordinance here and just walk through all the gray shaded changes, and we can also discuss this at the end.
Sure.
Move back to it.
So we've brought you a number of changes, many of which we talked about last time. So things that we covered last time, removing references to COVID since it's no longer applicable, the recommendation to eliminate parklets availability within buffered bike lanes, some language around barriers. So we talked about last time the challenge with engineering and where we're putting traffic engineering on what qualifies as a barrier. So what we're saying is that Jersey barriers are allowed by right, and if you would like a custom barrier, that's great, but the ball is gonna be in your court to get an engineer to verify that.
Can I bring up a point here, Chair, if you don't mind? And, I get concerned too about the aesthetics of downtown and what we just refinished all of Clayton Street, and do we really want to see a bunch of Jersey barriers? In each of the Jersey barriers can be very construction-like.
Yeah, well, that's why that's for engineer approved design.
The Jersey barriers are about right.
Yeah, the Jersey barriers are by right.
I agree. I guess I would ask Stephen this, if we had Jersey barriers that were within a facade, like covered with a planter box or integrated, say, into a small railing that went around, would that address the concerns of?
Yeah, so it's really an aesthetics question, and sure that we've seen pictures of folks who've done exactly that, put kind of wooden planters around something like a Jersey barrier.
So one option, because you could say no Jersey barriers, right? All we're going to allow is a parklet that is designed by an engineer and signed off by the same said engineer at the time it's built.
Well, I just want to go back to the reasons why we started allowing parklets was during COVID, and they were meant to be temporary in nature. And Jersey barriers aren't, they can be difficult to move sometimes.
Yes.
So do y'all see what I'm saying?
I mean, I'm good with like an engineer signed off design, if an engineer says that this can withstand, potential collision or whatever. I mean, I did some traveling up north and I sent y'all some pictures of assorted parklets, and, I think there was one that had a Jersey barrier that has a mural or something on it, but people come up with all kinds of different ways and these are along state roads moving through college towns in Western Massachusetts,
So I did want to be clear, and mention the engineer checking this would be looking to see that it meets that requirement of 250 horse-pounds of force. So it's a good thing that it's hard to move. It's still that 250 horse-pounds of force, though, just to let you know, that means that the full-grown adult human can't push and move it on their own. But it doesn't mean that it withstands a collision with a vehicle moving at any substantial speed. So, when you see Jersey barriers on the side of state highways, they're used for sideswipe collisions, right? Not necessarily a full-grown, full truck heading head on into it. We just need to make sure that the engineer knows exactly what they are signing off on. They're not signing off to say this will withstand a beer truck going 30 miles an hour at this thing. It's so that people can move it by themselves.
What do other communities have for the requirements for these barriers?
So
That's where this came from.
Yes,
Yeah,
we pulled it from other, and there's really no standard out there for protection against a vehicle.
Yeah.
This is really all so that people can't move these out of the way. It would take a lot more to stop a vehicle than anything that would be a temporary structure.
Yeah.
So really more kind of incidental
Yeah.
strike, right?
That's right.
If you're determined to ruin somebody's day in a parklet, you'll be able to.
That's right.
So can we add language for aesthetics? Like beautification, planters, murals, painting, or?
I think I'd be comfortable framing out some of that language, and we can go back and look at those codes. So I would say that would be, if y'all are concerned about aesthetics, that would be my recommendation to you. Either a Jersey barrier with aesthetic enhancements, which would either be like a facade placed around it or mural, however we're going to describe that. Or you just remove those references altogether and you just stick with an engineer supported process.
I think that engineers.
If it's an engineer supported process, does that mean the engineer determines the aesthetics of it, or,
Yeah.
Stephen, look at.
I mean, I don't know if it's, I don't know that they'd sign off any aesthetic. I know that our traffic engineer, if he were in here, would probably like the idea of something brightly colored. Or, just to,
Yeah, he's gonna spray paint everything, yellow,
right.
I'm good with brightly colored.
Yeah.
I think we just, if I can jump in really quickly, if we're talking about like aesthetic decisions to be made, that staff would make them, and I don't know how serious this conversation is, but I just want to be clear that we would need objective standards for staff, because you can imagine that there could be like freedom of speech issues and messages that people might want to put on these things, and so I would advise that we keep limitations and criteria to as objective a standard as we possibly can, and allow the aesthetic decisions to be made.
I kind of agree with that.
And so if you don't want to see Jersey barriers, we need to make it pretty clear, because it's the main option in here. The other thing that I know we discussed last time around is GOC was, if you don't allow Jersey barriers, the price is going to go up. So not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but that means there'll be less. And so you see a couple out there that, if an engineer looks at them, they probably don't need Jersey barriers, but it's because it's a lot of wood and and it's a big unmovable piece of decking. And so we might get more of those if we don't allow Jersey barriers. So that there could be.
I don't want to allow Jersey barriers, but have them something wrapped around so it doesn't look like a deer.
So just add that. I think is what we need y'all to give us feedback.
Like a specific color, like.
So you can see up here, D, I think it's D, under, it's E3 there. It says Jersey barriers are permitted by right. So we would need to add something in there.
How about we just add some language saying, enhanced and decorated or decorated or aesthetically enhanced Jersey berries are allowed by right.
It looks like you've got it, but then facades or other design features.
Yeah, I mean that.
Well, it's a may though, so that was allowing that without requiring it. So we could change that may to a shall. And
Yes.
now you've
Yes.
forced that.
Yeah.
It puts on facade around.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Is the committee good on that?
Let me, this may be a dumb question.
There's no such thing.
So are businesses downtown sort of asking for pallets? My thing is, do we have to have pallets? Is it necessary to have pallets at all in these businesses? And I'm just asking because I don't know. I know we started during the pandemic, doing outdoor dining. I guess my question is it necessary?
I believe it is. I believe that the more opportunities we have for outdoor dining and outdoor experiences, the greater, greater interaction there is in our community. And, I feel like it makes for a more democratic community. I know that downtown was greatly enhanced when we started allowing street sidewalk cafes.
Yeah. And I like that. I love the sidewalk, but the pallet thing,
You mean the parklets?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I know it expands the opportunities for patrons like myself. There are only a handful of establishments I regularly go to because I have a hearing issue, and restaurants tend to really mess with my hearing, and I have a hard time having conversations with the echoing, and I know a few other people like this too. So I always opt for outdoor dining. I think it, from a disability perspective, it enhances the opportunity for people to enjoy.
But for the aesthetics of downtown, when visitors come in town, join football games, family retreats, I would say I would like some type of I would like some type of aesthetic design for uniformity, if that's the word, or to look good. Like if you got this row of parklets and they're all Jersey barriers and different colors or whatnot, or just the standard color that they come in, it looks ugly. But if you have some sense of design that infuses Athens or something, makes it artsy, I don't know, What do y'all think?
I mean, they're only allowed to take up 30% of a block, so it's not like, I mean, I don't foresee you having more than one on each side of the block, maybe two. I mean, it's common, and towns, I mean, Chicago's been doing it for years, Asheville's been doing it for years. I know out west in California, they've been doing it, and up north, and all these college towns in New England, they have these parklets.
So real quick, just to get back to Commissioner Fisher's question. So if you look at demand, I think that's one way to help answer the question. How many businesses have we heard from just despite the current? So Angel and Andrew, how many businesses have reached out asking about parklets?
Only the 3 that have permits, the National, which went through theirs, and then, Paloma Park has asked about it, and that's it.
We haven't heard from a lot of people.
I mean, I don't think
Can I
it's
answer your
gonna be
question?
so.
That's sort of where I was going. I mean, is it a big deal or not? Especially if we don't have really big demand for business downtown. Again, I really don't want to really affect the, revenues that we're getting, you know, for parking and things like that. So that's just my thought. And again, I'm flexible, but I'm just saying, that's my big demand, and it's really a big deal to do this. So.
Right. Well, yeah, the people are banging down the door to do it. I don't mind putting something together, but it is taking up a lot of these folks' time.
Yeah.
To work with us on doing it. So we need to figure it out and get it moving on. I mean, and then you may have some changes in there that, you know, my issue was when they built the two structures. Yeah, two that are very, very permanent in nature.
So we have really 4 options for you all to consider about, what we call platforms or decks. So section E5. So here are your options. The first one is a maximum height of 16 inches above ground level, regardless of terrain. So that would mean somebody even with a level series of parking spaces can go 16 inches high. And then anytime you get too high, you're going to have a railing for ADA purposes. The second option is to set the highest point of the parklet as at the highest point of the curb. And there is some importance to allowing elevation to the curb, mainly an opportunity for a level transition for ADA access. So if you did that and still had 16 inches of maximum height, that would mean if my property sloped down, I benchmark off this top curb, I build level, and then when I hit that 16 inches, I either end my parklet or I'd have to step down and do another extension. The third option that we brought here is that kind of going strictly to ADA somewhat is that you could do, even with the top of the curb, we don't care about level. So if your parking spaces run at an unlevel space, so does your parklet and any associated deck. And then, of course, you have the option to eliminate decks altogether. That would mean that ADA access is either done through the installation of some form of ramp or a modification of the curb. And there's actually some methodology in here that if somebody does that, they have to provide funding to put the curb back should the parklet go away. So,
Just don't know about the decks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more concerned about the overall height than the height where it meets the curb. And I'm wondering if we can just set an overall height and it's relevant to, you know, the topography of where your parklet is.
So that'll be the 16, what you were recommending is 16 inches higher, correct?
So my recommendation initially was the top one. It said a maximum floor height of 16 inches, and then anywhere where you were above 6 inches, you'd have to have perimeter rail.
16 is a lot. And then you add your, 3.5 foot perimeter?
It becomes fairly
It's a
tall.
lot. Like maybe, I feel like we just cap it at like 4.5 feet overall. What do you think?
Well, just one reminder from what the mayor assigned to the GOC. The question was, look at the parklet program and make sure it aligns with our special events needs. So the higher you allow it, where they're going to be, and the more possible they're going to move, or if they need to move during special events, so they become less movable the taller they are. Just,
I mean, I can see how a platform is fine and maybe even necessary when it comes to topography. And it's not uncommon in other communities for these things to have platforms. But when you're getting something, an overall structure that's at eye level or above for even a short person, I think it kind of defeats the whole purpose of the parklets, which is, you know, to add vibrancy to our streetscape and to like enable this kind of, you know, interaction on the street, because you've got people in an enclosed environment and there's no interaction.
So I support what staff is recommending.
16 inches?
Yeah.
What if we lowered that to 12?
I think, so the only thing you're sacrificing, the reason why we picked 16 is we actually looked at the most severe cross slopes downtown, which occur on Lower Clayton and some portions of Lower Washington. 16 inches was approximately the amount of fall you get across two spaces, plus as much as 6 inches for a subframe within the deck. So basically where you go to curb height, you would have enough meat to have a frame under it that would hold it, and you weren't coming in and trying to bring your wood in level. But then you would have enough fall to make it level across two spaces. So we did try to pick that. Now that is the most severe condition downtown. We don't see a ton of that. The closest we've had was Parklet and Paloma Park, and even that is in a gentler portion of that grade.
What is the ADA required height for the railing?
36 is where railing is required. I don't actually recall off the top of my head what height ADA starts to require railings.
So I would just move on. I would recommend just taking staff recommendation of 16. Because if there's only where's my notes? If there's only 4 parklets, not that many businesses are participating, but there's only 2 currently that are an issue that just.
Well, and the other thing I think about too is, you know, just go ahead with staff recommendation and then recognize that these permits are only for a year.
Yeah.
If it becomes an issue, and we can come back with it.
And if you are worried, so here's the main difference I would tell you about option A and B there. So the first 5 and the second 5 kind of go into Commissioner Lake's concern. Let's go with South Kitchen, relatively flat. With the first option, they can elevate their deck to a maximum height of 16 inches, no questions asked. The second option there says you can elevate it to the top of your curb, and if it sticks out more on the back, that's fine, as long as you're not over 16 inches. So what you would get is actually less massing potential along the streetscape. You're almost always going to have more elevation on the parking side, but to some degree, we want that because now it's more prominent. You're less likely perhaps to get people backing into these things and then the decks, I will also point out, do allow perhaps better integration of that 250 pounds of force. Like you can't push what's over there.
So you're fine.
So the second one down, the one that's on the top of the page here, would be kind of your compromise of allowing for level installations, but making sure that people don't come out of the gate with the max.
Okay, so it's not by right, even if you have flat.
We're going to look at the top of your curve, and that's going to establish your highest point, and then everything below that must be below
I
16.
think that would look better.
Yeah.
So,
What do you feel? How you feel?
Yeah.
I'm flexible. I think
Yeah.
I go with staff recommendation.
Well, we have multiple of those. What I'm hearing is the second one might meet what we're hearing y'all say.
Right.
yeah, let's go with that.
Okay.
Let's move forward with that.
Okay.
And then scrolling down, there were no other substantial changes. We will point out that following, you just passed it, we said last time, it does remove reference to special events. And the way we explained it is this, 250 pounds of force is significant no matter how you create this, whether it's encased jersey barriers or decks or so on. So removing the full infrastructure is an endeavor, and in some cases may actually take a small crane or lift. So the special events ordinance does allow Actually, sorry, this ordinance does allow the manager to remove items for emergency or public health and safety. And the way that I explain that is this, that same language is in sidewalk cafes. So when we've been able to foresee very large storm events or maybe socially charged issues like protest or marches in a setting where we're worried about potential for rioting or social discourse, we will actually ask people to take up the furniture and say, hey, anything that could be removed and thrown through a window or carried down the block by a storm, we need you to get that inside. We haven't had them take down the barriers that I'm aware of. So we feel by eliminating number 2, it eliminates any confusion that a special events permittee can say, hey, no, I want every parklet up on this street. But it still gives the manager the authority to address safety as needed.
Sounds good to me. What about?
I do have a question, just not to throw a kink at anything, but and I know when we were talking about the environmental stations, some parking spaces may have been.
Eco stations.
Excuse me, because they've been for years. Eco stations. And I know there's some parking spaces to be utilized. I'm just again trying to picture running down Clayton Street and what I'm going to see.
Mm-hmm. And where those are,
Maybe we can worry about that later. I don't know.
Yeah, we're finalizing the design of those right now, and we could pull together the map that we did.
And how does that? And how does that
just show
where you would put how it crowds up that block?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's only one in Clayton now, but we are working on finalizing that design. And once we do, we're going to send a NOPA or something just to ping everybody because it's been so long. But let me pull up that map and email to all of y'all as well.
I mean, just not.
Yeah.
I think as that comes forward, what we could do is look at if there's a need to further limit parklets because we see the density of a specific block is going to be filled up.
Right. That's right.
I believe staff is comfortable enough that we can just make that recommendation for an ordinance change without coming back to committee.
Yep.
Good point, Mr. Hamby, Commissioner.
So that rounds out the proposed edits. We heard support for 2B, heard that Jersey barriers, changing the language to require some incorporation into a facade or similar, if used. That still won't allow us, and nor do we recommend, we're not regulating aesthetic, but I will also say that these represent the businesses. So we've seen that the businesses come forward, have made some investments, all in their different form.
Should we talk, probably don't go back and visit for pricing?
Yeah.
Please do.
So we got pricing and then how we handle the current parklets are the last two, I think we're going to discuss.
This chart is very helpful. And, I'm wondering, do y'all have any recommendations?
I mean, if you're looking for parity with how that space is valued, I would move to $7.50 a space per quarter. And that just says, look, it's either parking or a parklet, but it's basically the same to the average taxpayer of this county. That does remove any incentive. So right now it is actually weighted to encourage parklets.
A business will benefit from a parklet with the extra revenue of being outdoors. We don't, right? We want remote parklet, because COVID is resurging as we speak now, but beside the point, there's a benefit for the business. We don't want to hinder the business by charging too much, right? Because then it's not beneficial for them.
Well, they're making money using those spots, and which does help with some satisfaction. So, what are you're suggesting? What first?
So, if you were looking just to come in parity with average revenue generation, you'd be looking at $7.50 per space per quarter. So, $3,000 a space per year.
I think that's reasonable.
I mean, yeah, considering what, per square foot rent is on space downtown.
Do you feel that a business is going to be like, well, if I'm paying for the parking space, I'm not going to do a parklet?
But some of them may have it. Some of them
They told me they're making a ton of money, so I don't know.
I mean, $3,000 per year, how much is that a month? Like $400?
For two spaces, it'd be
350 a month.
350, yeah.
They're making that.
Yeah, I mean, you can make that in one night.
Well, I don't wanna hinder so I like outdoor eating, seating, and I want to promote more businesses to do that. But at the same time, there's a cost that the county and ADDA is losing from those parking spaces, but I just want it to be equitable or fair for the business to make money, to promote parklets, as well as the county to generate some decent revenue from it.
Well,
To burden.
Commissioner, to speak to what happened with the committee last time, if you look, the first two spaces under the current structure are not valued as the next two. So what that body recommended was, look, we like parklets. We don't want everybody to rush to a 4-space parklet. So the first two spaces are actually half the price of each additional space. You could follow a same mechanism. So you could say, if you wanted to follow parking revenue, $750 a quarter for the first two spaces, $750 for each additional space per quarter, or you could further discount it if you say, look, we're going to get other benefits. These are some of the higher fees that I know of us charging.
I think the 750s is where we should start and see. That should be the starting point.
So 750,
I'm sorry.
70.
First
space. That's
But the difference, if you got 4 spaces now versus what they're,
So if you got, it would be basically close to double. So if you got 4 spaces, you'd be looking at
3,000.
$12,000 a year plus the annual fee. So
And it's still cheaper than if you were doing construction there. It's still cheaper if you're paying the park, it's that parking lot.
right.
Parking space.
I mean, we had a legitimate reason for like actively encouraging these when we came up with this. You know, we wanted these businesses to be able to operate outdoors during the height of the pandemic. Now it's more of, you know, an enhancement of your business and an enhancement of downtown rather than like a health necessity.
Well, just anything that benefits businesses, I've been supportive, so.
I think with the opportunity to do this, that's benefiting the business.
Yeah, I mean, they're adding multiple tables and more opportunities to bring in revenue and encouraging people who would rather eat outside.
To be able to increase your seating capacity in restaurants, a big deal.
so is it $750 per space, even if you get up to 4? Or is it still $1,000 a space for the extra spaces if you get 3 or 4?
No, I mean, what we're talking about, what I'm hearing is just a flat $750 per space per quarter. Now you're not allowed to have less than 2 spaces. So we may still frame it where the first 2 spaces are X, be $1,500 a quarter. Each additional space is another $750. They're all valued the same. If you all want to encourage parklets, then I would say drop that first tier and leave the second or third and fourth spaces at full value.
I think the way you're saying that.
Yeah.
I think it's a reasonable.
Okay, so we will bring forward an ordinance recommendation. It's actually in the schedule of fees, so it'll be a different ordinance that would be recommended at $750 a space. One last question is, with these changes, especially with the height requirements, it is our approach that we cannot grandfather anybody in. So whatever the ordinance is you adopt would be the ordinance that would be conveyed to current permit holders and with the, setting expectations for January. If you all feel the need to grandfather somebody in, we would have the following recommendations. Definitely be time bound. Don't make it indefinite. That becomes very unwieldy. With these types of installations, you're probably looking at 1 to 3 years before some renovations are needed. The second is I would not recommend grandfathering in somebody on price because that's hard to defend. Grandfathering somebody in on construction well, they've made investments, they've modified that space. So if you all feel that you want to speak to what staff is gonna do and carry that recommendation forward to the body, that's what we would be looking for.
No grandfathering. My recommendation.
I mean,
Just what you're recommending, no grandfather.
He gave you all two options, either you can or not, or if you do,
Yeah.
we ask to be time bound,
I
yeah.
mean, since grandfathering, I'd say, till the beginning of until January.
Well, that,
Give them a few months
We've
to
got that.
figure it out.
Well,
So
their
that's already
permit
there.
goes till the end of.
I mean, I think the, 3 or 4 months that we have left in the calendar year is sufficient. I mean, it's not like these are
Cause this
massive
policy,
buildings, they're meant to be movable, structures that can come down.
The folks that would be potentially grandfathered in, were they aware of all that for?
were they aware?
That it would need to be movable?
No, well, the design they brought and we approved was consistent with the ordinance. So, and at no point could we have anticipated, that we would get such elevated, structures of mass that would cause this to come under further review, but nor could we read through the tea leaves and say like, hey, you may want to think about.
Maybe it's grandfathered in for 2 years or something like that. I mean, since you said it work would need to be done on structures. And I'm just sitting here thinking January's kind of right around the corner.
No, but it's not like a humongous structure.
They said they could spend about $80,000 on the day.
Sure, you want?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's hard to believe.
I speak this, and this might be something that might be better followed up with an email, and John and Austin and I can do that if we need to, but I think I would say our office probably has a lot of hesitancy with regards to the concept of grandfathering, right? Because there is no grandfather right, like these are permits, they end. And so, there's an argument that that's even a gratuity to sort of give them that extra time. And, I think it's hard to justify why, I realize they've invested a lot, but I think it's very clear that these are always meant to be removable, they're not permanent structures. And I think the case law is really clear that you don't have a right to expect anything beyond that one permit. And John and I talked about this, and he may want to chime in because he's got some experience with it with alcohol licensing. But John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure, Sherry, I can really quickly to further reiterate Sherry's point. Anytime you have a permit that is for a year for a term limited, the most common example that we deal with as local governments are usually alcohol licenses. But the case law has been very clear that you don't have an investment-backed expectation to continue that alcohol license year after year after year after year. That at that renewal period, you have to, there's a chance that you may not get your alcohol license back. And similarly with these types of things, because they are on a year-to-year basis, they don't have an investment-backed expectation necessarily to continue to be able to do the same thing year after year after year. That's a risk they take.
Makes sense.
sounds good.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
That's all the questions we have for y'all. I think at this point, you,
I'm ready to move forward.
okay.
Make a motion to move the full mayor commission changes and recommendations.
I'll say it.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All righty. The last thing on our agenda is, community benefits agreement and the leasing policy. Got to lead us in here
Yes, so,
real briefly.
real briefly on that, we talked about this 2 meetings ago, so it's been a little while. And when we talked about it, Andrew and Angel offered up options, and y'all asked them to zero in 2 of those options. So we sent out draft ordinances based on those 2 options. And so what we're planning to do today is just to remind you about our initial conversation, because it's been a while, show what that would look like in the 2 ordinances, and Andrew and Angel will walk you through that. And then just facilitate the discussion of any questions y'all might have. So originally we were trying to get this done before the Taylor Gray lease. At this point, we're moving forward with that lease because we know this might take some time. So there's not the time pressure as there was in the parklets. However, we did, Mayor and Commission did push the $1 lease to January 1st. So we do need to be done with this in time to notify all the current leases what their rate will be starting in January. With that, I'll hand it back to Andrew.
So following up what we talked about last time, we've brought you two options to consider. The first is just standardizing our nonprofit leases around flat rates based on their building size. So Cynthia, if you would go to page 2, that shows you the heart of the matter. That's the table that really breaks it down. So basically any building for a nonprofit entity that's under 5,000 square feet, the rates, of course, could be determined by you all, but what we're saying is, $800 a month, $9,600 a year, independent of location and use. And then you see the step ups for medium and large buildings. We do have a table if you all really want to start to look at numbers and compare to investments and also prior and current status as well. We do recommend with this dropping any reference to rental revenue sharing. So once the building is rented to them, they can't sublease it, but if they would like to host events, workshops, whatever, and there's rental revenue generated from that, we would not have a role in that. The other thing that would continue to be here is Section D, capital investments by tenant. So if a tenant is making investments that offsets the public's expense, so things like HVAC, roof, paint, anything that's in our capital program, that we would make recommendations to the commission. There's been 2 instances where that's happened in relatively recent history. The first is the cottage, paid for a pretty substantial renovation of the space they use, and the commission granted them a 10-year lease. And then the other was Advantage Behavioral, which fully renovated an ACC Gov building to make it for a care facility. And for us, that's very defensible because we can tell you what the value of those avoided expenses are. So this is definitely the simplest option, is just to classify by tiers and call it a day. Option 2, which Cynthia will pull up. Well, I guess before we go to that, are there any questions about that one?
So if you got a small nonprofit that's using our facility and I saw the price was like 800. Yeah, $800 monthly. I'll be honest with y'all, I've always had issues when taxpayers, and especially when it's impacting people in our community or helping folks, and we're charging. And I know you all been through this and the just extra talking, but and I guess when I look at the one agency I look at is I'm going to break right now, is anyway, small nonprofit that's working with kids, the Athens-Clarke program, for example. They're using our facilities to the kids.
Right.
They working on a shoestring budget. Not $600 a year would kill them.
Well, the other, to your point too, that's right. I hate to say this, but I don't know how many buildings we were out there leasing out. Maybe I do have something we can get to see that, but to your point too, I didn't release something to Advantage. If we are, Advantage to work they're doing to help us in the community. Just try to give them the deal. And maybe at some point we have a discussion
Isn't
about.
that where the community benefits agreement comes in and the massive discount comes in?
So this is the gratuities clause. You guys heard me talk about.
You could always sell buildings for a certain price.
Yeah, and I'm sure Andy's gonna mention this, but we're keeping governmental entities out of this, and quasi-governmental entities out of Advantage falls under that, so it's a totally different issue. But yes, I think fundamentally the answer to both your questions is the gratuities clause, in the sense that we can't just give away public property. And there's a really strong argument that even just leasing a property for $1 a year is essentially giving public property away. And I think part of the concern is you know, how do you decide what nonprofit gets government building for free? Because there's clearly hundreds of wonderful nonprofits here and very few that actually get to lease our properties.
I think Behavioral Health, actually, they're like they pay us for maintenance.
They do.
So they don't pay us, they just pay us back what we spend on the building to maintain it.
You should help me understand the gratuity,
Sure.
law.
Yes, please. So it's the gratuitous clause of the Georgia Constitution, so it actually is not a law, it's a constitutional provision, and what it says, and I can pull it up, but, and John is also an expert on this as well, but it essentially says that the government is not gonna give anything away using taxpayer funds, and they're not gonna forgive a debt. And so the argument is essentially that if you provide things that are government resources that have value for free, even if it's to a good entity doing good work, the case law says that that isn't necessarily enough. And that's a really, really condensed version of what the gratuitous clause says. I can send you some memos. But John, I see you've got your screen. Did you want to share some thoughts?
I think you encapsulated it pretty well, Sherry. I mean, you know, and I know that we talk about the gratuities clause a lot, but it is, you know, it can be challenged in court, and so, you know, you can have taxpayer lawsuits, things like that, for a gratuities clause challenge, and so that's one reason that we always want to make sure we're thinking about that, just to make sure that we don't have to deal with anything on the back end. But like Sherry said, I mean, it's the basic concept of the gratuities clause is that when you have governmental property, it has to, and if the government is allowing another party to use it other than the government, that the government needs to receive some sort of substantial benefit in return for that. And obviously with a lease, if you're charging $1, there's a potential argument to be made that you know, that amounts to a gratuity.
Well, so let me ask you, so I'm looking at the agencies that we gather up here. We're giving them money. I mean, we fund.
Number of them.
Yeah, we're funding them. So to me, it's like, okay, well, we'll fund y'all, but then we're gonna charge y'all too. And I get it. I truly do get it, but it's I just think.
That's where the CBA comes in, don't we offer massive discounts for approved community? That's what we're discussing,
There's
right?
gotta be a better way, yes.
So there's a number of things going on here. So if I can back up to Commissioner Lynn's question, the reason that we are not talking about the CBA, you may remember from a couple meetings ago, and it's been a bit, we have some real concerns about how you could ever possibly quantify community benefit, and it creates a situation where there really aren't objective standards. And so it puts our staff in a position of having to decide, you know, for instance, a nonprofit that gives books to kids versus a domestic violence shelter, or, you know, what, insert your group of choice. Like, how do you say this one is more valuable to the community versus this one, and this one deserves space at X rent and this one doesn't, or vice versa? And so those are the challenges that we realized in trying to implement a CBA, that it would just be incredibly difficult, to the point where it would almost be arguably meaningless, because pretty much any nonprofit could arguably meet the idea of a community benefit agreement. In terms of your argument, I think that there's probably a more nuanced conversation that might need to happen outside of this meeting about independent agency funding and the gratuities issue. But fundamentally, what John said is right, that if we're just saying here you can have this building for free, it's hard to argue why there's a governmental interest or a public benefit, even though we may fund someone through grant funding or independent agency funding. So that's the reason that we had concerned about the CBA, and that's also the reason we had concerns about the $1. If we can have, you know, all of these rents are heavily subsidized, so even though they are getting some money back to taxpayers, it's by no means market rate. You know, so maybe there's a slightly lower number that you all might want to look at that isn't de minimis, but is also not market rate. But that's where the legal concerns are.
I mean,
Which is why we offered the flat rate tiers,
Right.
Because that's not market. So the last meeting, we put out 4 options. One was market rate, and y'all saw how high that really was, and said no to that. The second was one of the ones that Andrew showed you, the eliminate the tenant-based reductions. The third was flat tiers, and we could decide what those tiers were. And then the last was just just keep going with the dollar, because from staff's perspective, I'm not gonna speak for the county attorney's office, we just need to know. We can't keep leading our leases on what it's gonna be. And the one thing I would add about independent agencies, what we found out as we tried to implement this a couple times, and we actually never have gotten a chance to, is that people were trying to become independent agencies to lower their rent, which is not why there's independent agencies. So, and as we talked about in the budget process this year, we're going to be redesigning the independent agency process as well. So you know, it would be hard for somebody to know what their rent might be if in a given year y'all might decide to go a different direction with independent agencies. So I don't know if tying those two things together is a good thing either. I just wanted to put all that out there.
I'm just picking back on Dexter's, example, you know, Athens tutorial, they'd have to shut down.
Yeah.
I mean,
And that's, yeah.
and I see the neighborhood health center. I mean, you know, $30,000 is a lot of dollars for them. I mean, maybe there's some other way, but I guess you're trying to charge a flat rate for these tiers to help with the life cycle costs. I mean, what are we trying to achieve here?
So the problem, one of the reasons why this came up was because, well, Parker brought it up for equity, but from the county perspective, when it comes to painting, when it comes to yard maintenance, it's costing us. So we want to subsidize these tenants.
Scroll down, if you don't mind, to the total. It's really not that, I mean, I know it's $1, but it's a difference of $386,000 for the 5-year life cycle. That's, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a whole lot of money. So I would advocate for just, why do we need to change it? I mean, the dollar's fine.
I think that there's some inequity in charging $1 for, you know, the Taylor Grady house and $1 for the Hancock development house. I mean, there's inequity in the properties themselves. So I am all for, you know, a minimal charge that is based on the property. And you've come up with this 3-tier scale, which I don't think is very equitable either, because there's a big difference between a 5,000 square foot property and a 1,200 square foot property. So maybe we come up with a scale that's more like charging by the 100 square feet or 500 square feet.
Well, that's basically what you have is option 2, column H here. It is based off of the size of the facility and the services rendered. Mm-hmm. So what we looked at, and this probably speaks to Dexter more than anybody, I'm sorry, Commissioner Fisher.
That's okay, no worries. No worries. We've been knowing each other a long time.
Right, so many committees. Is that there are some efficiencies that can occur. So for example, downtown Park. It's in a multi-tenant building that requires no landscape services. So it is actually cheaper per square foot for the county to maintain that than say the Brumby House, which is one of the oldest houses in Athens with a very ornate garden. So we had some factors, and that's actually shown in option 2, is if you drop anything tenant-based, here's what we would charge, you know, loosely based off of market factors and services. It tends to work out well for smaller tenants, but as you get into the older and properties, so Town and Gown Theater is one that stands out right away. You know, their rent would be going to nearly $41,000 a year. That's not going to be tenable. So, you know, we could look at different tiers. We could have more tiers.
One would need, you know, we need to think about those who are making revenue off the building as well. You know, so I think setting $1 for a group that's going to make money, that's very different. So potentially, one option is just to have the attorney's office do research on community benefit agreements and offer up an option that might be
I think we should
viable,
start with that.
because that could be how you do it. But I think not all these are the same up here. So I hear y'all saying that and definitely agree.
Not cut you off.
Yeah.
Well, I see the comment with the East Athens development and Action 2, they sort of share that building.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if we're gonna hit both of them, both of them at 600. So what I could get to then maybe split that in half. I don't know, well, depends on what we come up with, but I know, like, Mr. Hammond said, Astor Tour would actually go out of business. I mean, they can't, they're not gonna be able to afford 9,600, you know, like, annually, they just not. I know they're not. I mean, we were giving them, we up what we gave them this year, but they won't be, they have to leave, go fast, they won't be able to stay there.
One, we do what Josh recommended, get with Sherry, come up with some fourth option.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can certainly try. I'll just say, I think Judd is deeply concerned about community benefits agreements, because I just don't know how we could possibly ever measure that. So, you know, maybe there's some distinctions about, revenue sharing, or maybe that's a better thing to think about, but the idea of the use of the property to some extent, but I'm pretty uncomfortable with those as well. I mean, you know, fundamentally, you asked why we're doing this. I think the reason is that we recognize that entities are being treated inequitably, and now we're trying to come up with an equitable and legally defensible process. And that's where John and I have concerns about the $1 leases, that it's not necessarily legally defensible if a challenge is raised. But I see John has jumped on if he wants to add something.
No, Sherry, you said basically what I was going to say, so.
Yeah, so basically, I think we're all happy to go back and talk about it and continue, but I just don't know that we're gonna come back with a magic answer to this, so I'm not sure that one exists.
But I guess the question I would have to that is that what's the number? If not $1, is it 200 a month? You know, we need a floor is what we need.
So there's a flat rate, option 3.
Right, but y'all have the ability to decide what you want on that flat rate. So the question for the attorney's office would be, how low can that flat rate go that y'all would be comfortable with? Is what I think that fourth option would be.
Saunders, at our next meeting, can we get a price of what each of these facilities is costing the county?
Well, that's only capital. So that doesn't account for the daily services rendered through landscape or facility maintenance.
Yeah.
Yes, we'd be happy to capture that. If you all would be amenable, we would also be happy to bring back some different tiering structures. I will tell you, based off of today's conversation, I don't hear a lot of love for option 2, because it does skew, it doesn't seem to capture values that are happening in some of our older or larger buildings. But what I'm also hearing is, hey, if I'm renting 1,100 square feet, it seems like I shouldn't pay as much as somebody who's renting 3,800, which tells me maybe we just need to have more tiers and look at that separation of pricing, and go from there. Bring those back to you. I think we probably are getting close to approaching a point where we're going to run into an operational challenge with our current tenants, because their tenant is set at $1 through January 1.
Right.
Or to January 1. So if we don't find a path forward, because you think about it from their perspective, they're likely to receive some cost, right? Whether it's $2,000 or $10,000 is to be determined. But to hear that 2 months before that cost is due versus 6 months or 8 months is certainly very important to an entity like that. So I guess what I'm setting the stage for is, at the next meeting, we may recommend to you some extension, just to buy room. I think it would be great if that extension came with some clarity for those tenants
That'd be our
on
preference,
what the rules are when the extension ends.
Yeah. You do that.
So we can shoot for next meeting either way. That accepts it.
Before everybody leave, on the table for our next meeting, do y'all want to revisit and finalize the inclusive Athens-Clarke County inclusive facilities, or move on to BACs or renter protections or review ACC employee engagement? So we usually have 2 topics at each meeting. Currently we just have the leasing policy for our next meeting, but
It's evaluate opportunities for inclusive rate.
We have some follow-up items for you on that, since it's been a couple months.
So maybe tackle that one. We don't really have any BACs coming up anytime soon. So
December.
December.
Yeah, we need to look at that.
But that's gonna be a lengthy.
It is.
It'll be at least 4 or 5 months.
I'd rather talk about, yeah, let's do the BACs and finish this one up, the community benefits group.
Okay, so we're not doing facilities, inclusive facilities, is that what I heard?
I can make,
It's up to y'all.
So,
Yeah, I like Mike, I think we need to tackle the BAC thing.
Okay,
just so we can get Gene ready.
sounds good.
okay.
Motion to adjourn.
So move.
All in favor, say aye.
Right.